Okay, here we are again with our tutorial series, and this is Unit 2. And basically what we're talking about today is a basic workflow. And the purpose of this is going to be to create something that the client can see based on a model that you make. So if you're making a model and you want to show them what it looks like, they don't have the same programs in your computer, they don't have Lightwave, they don't have layout, so you want to send them a bitmap image, and that's what we're going to do. And this is a classic workflow that you're going to use again and again with many objects. So basically we're going to start in Modeler, work our way through layout, and then export a bitmap frame. Okay, here we are in Modeler, and we're going to pretend that we just made this object. Now as you can see, it's relatively complex, but it's not as complicated as it looks like. Basically what we've got here is something that started with a primitive, was hollowed out with a Boolean subtract, so the inside became hollow. And you can see, if you look around it, that you can see through parts of it, but it still has substance. And we carved the numbers in there using a Boolean subtract also. Not as difficult as it may seem. We put some rounded edges on there. We've already talked about that a little bit. So let's pretend that we've just made this and we want the client to see it. So right now it's in Modeler. This is the workshop. This is what we did all the actual work in. And as you can see, if we were to grab some of those points and move them, for example, we could still affect the object, so it's still in the workshop. I'm going to Control Z that. And then of course, oops, Control Z it again. I turn off move, and there we go. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to save this as an object, assuming we haven't done so already. So I'm going to go up here, File, Save Object As, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it on the desktop for the moment, and I'm just going to call this blue dye, and I'm going to save that so it's on the desktop. So then when we go over here to layout, now layout has a very boring look when you first get into it, and what I usually do first is I go right up here and I go from the current camera and I set it up to look at perspective. And this shows me my studio floor. Essentially, you don't make things here, you present them. So you've got your camera and your lighting, and basically a completely empty studio with no walls and no ceiling. So what we're going to do is we're going to put that blue dye onto the studio floor. And so I'm going to load the object, and I'm going to take it from the desktop, and I'm going to take blue dye right there, take it right down in there, and there it is. Alright, so there is my blue dye. You can see the camera sees it. I'm going to grab the light just in case it's an issue, and I'm just going to move it back here. And I notice you've got the three arrows. The green arrow moves things up and down, the red arrow moves things left and right, and the blue arrow moves things forward and backward. And so here you don't have the same three screens you do in Modeler, so sometimes you've got to be a little bit careful. You've got to use your rotate tool up here to see where things are in relation to other things. And of course you've got your camera, which is looking at the object right now. So if you wanted to see the point of view of the camera, we're going to go over here to Camera View, and we're going to call up Camera. And predictably, we see what the camera was pointing at. And so from here, basically what we want to do is make a composition. So if I click on the actual object, you'll see it creates a frame around it. You'll also notice down here under Current Item that the object is selected. And so from here, if I am under Modify, Move is set by default. If I move the red arrow, I'm moving it left and right. If I move the green arrow, I'm moving it up and down. The blue arrow is a little bit harder to grab because it's basically on the line, so we'd have to do that in perspective view, but we could move this in and out as well. So what I'm going to do also, if I'm going to under Modify, if I go to Rotate, I now have a series of rings. The green ring allows me to rotate this object on that axis, forward and backward. The red ring spins it around like this, let's say, and the blue ring, or the green ring rather, it's a little cockeyed look here. And so let's say we put it like that. We don't have to worry about the floor here. This isn't actually a floor, it's empty space. And so what I want to do is I want to make a little bit more composition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load another version of the same object. So I'm going to take the blue dye again, load it in again. Now I notice it loads in at the default position, which is inside this object. So obviously that's not going to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to move this out of it a little bit. And so let's say we bring it up some. And I want to make it look like it's a little bit further back. And so to do that, I'm going to go briefly into perspective view. And I'm just going to move that back there a little bit in the distance. So then if we look back at camera view, that's a little bit better. So if I can even make that appear slightly behind. And let's go with that. And let's also maybe rotate this a little bit. I kind of like it when the numbers shine some, but maybe not blinding. So emphasize those highlights. Let's say like that. And lastly, if you come down here, notice object is selected. If I select camera, there's only one camera available to me. So if I push anywhere on the screen, I can move the camera forward and backward, kind of like that. If I right click on it, I can move the camera up and down. So let's say like that. I can also rotate the camera, so I could make the camera look at basically anything you want. But let's say we go with this. All right, so if you want to get a quick look at something, what you do is you hit the F9 button. And you'll notice that we have a lot more complex highlights and curves there, specularities. That's because of all the ray tracing. Now if I hit, well, before I continue, notice up here though that the default resolution is 640 by 480. Now that just plain sucks. But we can fix it, and we will in a minute. But first I'd like to take you beyond this. When you hit Control here, you can see that this is your rendered window, and this is what the client will ultimately see. And we can save this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to File, Save RGBA, and here you have a whole list of possible formats. Now this would intimidate just about anybody, but don't worry. The dirty little secret is that almost nobody knows what all these things are, and most people never use most of them. There's a couple that stand out. For example, you got your TIFF format down here, which is good for CMYK. Most of the time, you're probably going to stick to the more common ones like the PNG format, which is what I would recommend at this point. Now, PNG comes in two flavors, 24-bit and 32-bit. 24-bit still has millions of colors, more than you'll ever really need, but it has no transparency. 32-bit will knock out the background for you. So instead of a black background, it'll have a transparent background. I'm going to go with that one. And I'm just going to put it right on the desktop here. And I'm just going to call it blue dice. And so there we have our blue dice saved. And so this is how the blue dice would render. This is looking at it in the Windows photo program. And as you can see, if you scooch in on this a little bit, you can see you get some jaggedies pretty quickly. That's because 640 by 480 is not a particularly good format. But the important thing to remember is that this is a bitmap image now. The image that you see here, let me turn this off, the image that you see here is a vector image. So meaning that you can adjust this any way you want to and get more quality out of it, and you can actually render this big enough to print on a wall and not lose anything. But we have to change the settings to make that happen. So if you go into the Render tab up here and you go to your Render Globals, you will see that you have everything that you need to do to render anything. Now here, we're going to stick with the Camera tab, and you notice, lo and behold, there is your 640 by 480. I'm going to change this to 1000, and I'm going to put the height here at 1000 also. Now if I were to do that, you will notice that the composition gets more narrow, and that's because what I've basically done is I've changed the viewport of the camera. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take the height down to 750, and that will bring the proportions back to a rectangular view. So if I turn this off, you can see that anything in the dark area is not going to be seen, anything in the light area is. So if I hit F9 again, I'll render another view. Okay, so as you can see here, this particular rendering is a whole lot more juicy. It's got 1000 by 750 pixels, and you can see the the window is larger as well, and the details are better. And so once again, we save RGB, and I'm going to bring this once again 32-bit PNG, and I'm just going to call that Blue Dice Big. And so you can see this is the completed project on the larger version of the rendering, which holds up a little bit better when you get a closer look at it. You can see you're not quite seeing the jaggies quite as fast as you were on this one.